Hello, everybody. I know it's been a while. I've been dealing with a lot lately. I've been getting my license, preparing for college, things like that. Um, I'll actually be going this Monday, so I'm not really sure how active I'll be on the video making front. Um, but I'll definitely still be around either way. You're stuck with me either way, so don't worry. Today I wanted to talk about something really brief but pretty major as far as OU trends go. Hail. Hail is a very weird archetype because it's been historically one of the weaker ones. And usually it's had very little to go off of. So in past generations, we've seen at most ice body wall rain be abused on hail stalls back when weather was permanent. This residual damage was also a relatively big deal when the weather was permanent because it essentially meant that unless you were an ice type, you were taking damage, which contrasted heavily with sand, which kept rock, ground, and steel types safe. The latter two of which of which are were and are pretty important types. Moreover, most setters have been wholly mediocre, mainly due to mediocre defensive typings and subpar speed. Araris and Abomasnow have weaknesses to some pretty strong offensive types, and their speed tiers left quite a bit to be desired. However, in Gen 7, we saw some pretty big changes. For one, we got Slush Rush, an amazing setter in Alolan Ninetales, and a decent one in Vanillux, but Alolan Ninetales is definitely the superior one. And above all else, Aurora Veil, which sets the effect of both screens simultaneously. Aurora Veil was monumental to the point where Alolan Ninetales itself was and still is used on screen's offenses. However, the lack of good Slush Rush abusers really didn't let the archetype come into its own. And that's mainly because it was limited to Sand Slash, which, yeah, its defensive typing isn't that good. And in general, yeah. And then there's Bear Tick, which ended up getting um, a gigantic attack buff. But aside from that, I think, yeah, those were the only two ones. So, in any case, Aurora Veil in an actual setter really did help, but the archetype still suffered from the lack of good abusers and ones that just wouldn't weigh down the team and reinforce weaknesses. Um, so let's talk about the present day. Hail is the talk of the town all of a sudden, and some people are really surprised by it. I mean, hell, I am. However, there's one very simple reason as to why it's so good all of a sudden, and that reason is Arctozolt. Arctozolt is a Pokemon with a very coveted Ice-Electric Stab combo, and although its offenses may seem mediocre on paper, they are reinforced with high-power stabs in Blizzard and Voltbeak, the latter of which is a stupid move that does obscene levels of damage when factoring in its doubled power upon moving first and its stab bonus. In essence, although it may have mediocre offenses, it hurts like absolute hell. At base 55 speed is pretty bad, but its access to Slushers offsets this just enough to where it can outpace every relevant threat in the tier outside of Tibid's Choice Scarf Tapu Lele, Kartana, and Lander's T. However, the latter two leave a bit to be desired with the Choice Scarf, and you should be using Modest Tapu Lele anyway. I pretty much talked about all of this, but to keep it short, it is absolutely fucking wild as an abuser, and single-handedly blows this archetype out of the water for being niche to something legitimately threatening. This is hugely because Arctozolt takes advantage of a lot of the trends that we're seeing right now. A lot of teams rely on Corviknight, Buzzwole, Tapu Fini, bulky ground types, and Galarian Slowking quite a bit to provide ample ground against things like Urshifu, Rapid Strike, Kartana, and Weavile. Although somewhat prediction reliant, on paper we've seen Substitute Surge is a very popular fourth move, which takes advantage of force switches and alleviates a lot of pressure to predict correctly, and adds yet another option the opponent has to carefully consider and get right. That's not to say it's foolproof, but it does turn Arctozolt from being prediction reliant into something more consistent. It tends to run Boltbeak, Blizzard to screw with Buzzwole, and Low Kick or Freeze Dry. Freeze Dry would be to hit Swampert and Gastrodon, but you would usually want Low Kicks so you can actually hit like Magnezone and Ferrothorn. Um, and then there's Substitute. The perfect storm of additions that we've seen in Generation 7 on top of the common metagame trends and Arctozolt's stupid options make Hail legitimately viable. It's not just this, but also the fact that Arctozolt's sheer consistency as an abuser as well as Aurora Veil being really fantastic at enabling teams lets those last four slots play more flexibly. We sometimes see other forms of abuse like Weather Ball to screwball bulky ground types like Landorus T, and then pairing it with Pokemon that actually appreciate having Landorus T screwballed. But more often than not, Arctozolt is more than enough for the job. I feel as though a Landorus T of your own is a near necessity as a bulky ground type, able to provide momentum and add additional pressure on top of Hail with Toxic and Stealth Rock. So it would be something. Excuse me. So it would be something like this. So it would be Stealth Rock. No, it's not knockoff. My bad. Stealth Rock, Earthquake, Toxic, and U-turn. Move orders on viable. I know. Generally, I feel like you need negative priority. Negative priority. You need enough speed for Adamant Crawdon, and then you just put careful, and yeah, there's really no reason to run a lot of speed on your utility Landos right now. So leftovers, Intimidate, and this generally is pretty reliable. Then you can also pair it with things like Heatran, Corviknight, or Weavile, and Rising Star Volcanion. We've been seeing a lot of choice specs of Volcanion, and even some heavy duty boot sets, which are really good on bulky offenses and are really hard to switch into. And usually you'd have these as options to reinforce Hail, and more often than not, they do really well in providing Arctozolt a lot of leeway when dealing with revenge killers or other Pokemon that might scare it out. You could even run offensive pivots like Dragapult or Urshifu Rapid Strike if you really want to step it up a notch and abuse Arctozolt's crazy good matchup spread by actually pivoting against their conventional checks. So Urshifu can say pivot against like Toxapex or Bulky Waters, which Arctozolt preys on and really well, and Dragapult against bulky ground types or in general Tapu Fini, things like that. Then you reinforce cores, Corviknight. Then you can just kind of play around with these slots for Subburst Kyurem, for example, is pretty good, especially with Aurora Veil to back it up. You have Heatran's pretty good, especially as as an option to get out against especially when their hail subsides. It's really helpful for that. So in short, Arctozolt's insane prowess as a solitary abuser really lets you innovate hail and actually round it off with a range of synergistic options to make it make it more consistent, not as consistent, which I feel is really prominent toward its success as of late. So now let's talk about oh wait sorry, I meant to skip to this part way through. But yeah, I also forgot to mention here that Alolan Ninetales is really good at facilitating these cores. It's got a good defensive typing, which can be helpful in soft checking Weavile, and it's got really good speed and some pretty awesome utility too. Like Aurora Veil, like I mentioned earlier, can be really good at reinforcing your cores, especially Subru's Cure, it's a freaking demon. Um, so with that in mind, let's talk about counterplay. Of course, with how much hail has changed things, it's not surprising we've been seeing people attempt to really ward it off. Due to how much we need these backbones to check other offensive threats, the metagame has adapted really slowly because it's basically a trade-off with a sizable opportunity cost just to check Arctozolt. Because this, a lot of counterplay comes in the form of actually capitalizing on Arctozolt's reliance on hail to be threatening by wasting turns and forcing it to get predictions right, on top of exploiting Arctozolt's mediocre offenses and reliance on heavy-duty boots to maximize its switching opportunities. Every turn is vital for Arctozolt, and with every turn it gets little value, the easier it is to stave off. Of course, though, this means having to get several predictions right, and in many cases it leads to you forcibly having key walls shipped repeatedly, which makes this not the easiest pull off even if you have a stronger matchup. In terms of consistent options, so there are three that mainly come to mind. Scizor is a pretty big one. Magdazone, and then Ferrothorn. All bulky steel types. So Scizor and Vactazone are pretty good as Pokemon willing to soak a couple hits. Vactazone resists both of Arctozolt's stabs, and although it's weak to low kick, Magnezone can still pigeonhole it into using it in the first place if a substitute isn't set up. And Scizor has access to bullet punch as a form of damage control. On top of having very respectable physical bulk and roost of waste turns, and being a very good option to exploit and a little Ninetales for a positioning opportunity. And plus, these two Pokemon also pair really, really well together, since Magnezone traps and removes key roadblocks for Scizor, and Scizor can help position Magnezone in the first place. And as long as you have a ground type to reinforce them and play and not just get overwhelmed by Volbeak, they can work pretty well. And then there's of course Ferrothorn, which is considered to be generally the best blanket check to it. Pretty good. Checks quite a bit. You got like Tapu Fini, Weavile. It's pretty good against Arctozolt as well. It takes quite a bit from low kick, but you still force it to take like Iron Barbs damage, and although it can be a little overwhelming, you still pigeonhole it into using certain attacks because of the fact that it can soak Blizzard and it's resist Bolt Beak, and low kick isn't generally the most optimal option to use, and that's kind of part of why Magnezone is works pretty solidly. Um, I personally am more partial to the body press set, so that would be Iron Defense, Body Press, Thunderbolt, and Toxic. Toxic for bulky grounds. You screw Lando T and Hippo and stuff like that. You run leftovers, Magnapole, and then Menace Speed. It really kind of depends on the team, but I personally shoot for um excuse me. Um what is the threshold I usually hit? I think nowadays for me it's just uninvested Heatran, or because Heatran isn't really running as much speed nowadays. So this works okay. You can go a little more speed too if you really want to cover that, but I guess it really does kind of come down to how well you're able to check faster steals. Bisharp's not that big of a deal. It used to run max timid, but it doesn't really need to anymore. So that's all fine and dandy. And then Scizor is just Swords Dance, Bullet Punch, U-turn, Roost, and it runs like I don't recall the spread at the top of my head, but it runs enough for for Sacred Sword Kartana with the Choice Band. But in any case, you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. Even though these Pokemon can be good short-term techs, they're good at wasting turns and pigeonholing its options. But at the end of the day, they can be overwhelmed, and that's why it's very difficult to actually check Arctozolt and why it's so good at exploiting so many cores right now, even if you have options against it. Um, and there's also Gastrodon and Swampert, which are pretty good against non-freeze dry variants, but it's another matchup kind of thing. If you can't do that, uh, then they just die to freeze dry. Um, So, and then there's also Mamoswine too, but it's kind of the same thing with like low kick and whatnot. But it can exert some pretty good offensive pressure. So, anyway, with all this on the table, I think I'd like to talk to you guys what I think about it, and I think it's really cool to see what was historically mediocre become legitimately the best weather. And what makes it even cooler is that it's not stagnant. We're seeing tons of really interesting compositions and innovations that really encourage you to find ways to exploit, enable, and benefit off of Arctozolt. I don't really think it's broken, especially given we're still awaiting the metagame to properly adapt, and how crucial each turn of Hail um, is given Archizolt's reliance on it. It could evolve into a problem, but for right now, I think it's a very welcome, interesting presence in the tier, and I'd argue to a degree it's also a healthy one, since it helps newer players detect their win conditions and learn ways in which to enable it and facilitate it. So, with all this on the table, what do you think? Do you think it's broken? Do you like it? Do you not? Why or why not? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and I'll be happy to reply where I can. I hope you all have a great rest of your weekend, and thanks for watching.